Welcome to The Udna, where curious minds gather for deep, intentional conversations that spark new understanding. I'm your host, Deepa Mrichandani, founder of the Deep and Meaningful Consultancy. Much like an ancient salon or an Indian Udna, we believe the biggest challenges of our time demand more than quick takes. They call for nuanced dialogue, deliberate questioning, and a willingness to explore the uncomfortable. Udna is the Hindi word for that space where diverse perspectives collide and transform understanding, hopefully leading to more conscious action. In today's episode, I'm speaking with renowned conservationist and rewilder Alastair Driver. With nearly 50 years in conservation leadership, 34 years in public service, Ali's worked at the local, national and international levels, advising everyone from local communities to government at home and abroad, as well as the EU, the UN, the Commonwealth Secretariat, as well as hundreds, if not thousands of kids up and down the country on nature conservation and rewilding. It's with the latter that he really comes alive as he sparks curiosity and the wonder of the natural world into little humans that is likely to stay with them for the rest of their lives. This conversation was initially ignited around a campfire when Ali reflected on our moral duty as humans to take action to not just conserve our planet and her natural resources, but to help them thrive. Here we went a little deeper and explored everything from the complexities of navigating the policy landscape over decades and how mindsets have evolved, even if our 4-year political terms haven't caught up to the needs of long-term planning. We get into the role of the private sector in paying their dues for climate impacts, and I get out my grievance of the commodification of nature through credits and nature-based markets. It's a pure privilege to chat to Ali. His no-nonsense attitude to doing good work and doing right by nature and our non-sentient siblings is infectious. His moral compass is set at go, sparked at a young age when, in his words, he was a feral child, always out, observing, learning and playing in nature. Decades on, he's still out there, with the same wonder and curiosity. He left this chat to go off and look in on some hedgehogs in his village, and I couldn't help but be a little bit jealous and wished I was going off to see them too. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Thank you so much for spending time with me. As I was just saying to you, this conversation was sparked one night around a fire, and it was me latching on to, I think, something that you said maybe a little bit in passing as part of a bigger context when you talked about conservation and morality and us having a moral imperative to think about conservation in a much more smarter, nuanced way. And it just hit me in quite an emotional way of, we don't talk about this enough. And so I'm really thrilled that you're here to let me itch the scab a little bit and pick your brain about this. And as I've been, and like I was saying, as I've been reading more, the more I've realized that when it comes to the ethics and morality and these ideas of right and wrong and, and says who and for whom, it gets really complicated. And so where I thought I might have clear-cut views on some things, actually it turns out that maybe I don't so much. So I'm excited and intrigued to see what comes out with talking to you about this. But I wanted to start with you personally, because you've been working in this space for decades. And it did make me wonder about what drew you to conservation and environmental work more broadly. And was there a moment when you felt that this was a calling or there was a moral imperative to where you started out, and what brought that about?
Interesting. The first thing to say is I'm quite a simple thinking kind of guy. So probably a lot of this conversation, I'll probably be relatively short and abrupt on quite a few things, because I tend to decomplicate, to simplify things as best I can. So you won't necessarily get a lot of deep thinking out of me. because I tend to have very clear clear thoughts on
That
what
doesn't
we
mean
should
it's
and
not.
shouldn't
That
do.
doesn't mean it's not
I
deep.
yeah,
It
let's
just
see,
means you're clear
let's
about.
see what we yeah, see where we get to. In terms of the background, I mean, I was lucky that I was brought up in the middle of nowhere in the Cotswolds, in a 14th century cottage under the beechwoods, middle of nowhere in the 60s, roaming the countryside, feral childhood, and basically the parish boundary was my playground, and I was doing that pretty much for as soon as I could walk. And every holiday of every year, I was on a remote island off the coast of Wales called Bardsey, which my dad used to run bird watching trips to in the 50s, and then we had a house there in the 60s, and I spent every holiday of every year, through my childhood, teens, and indeed have been back with my children since. Um, and um, and I had a father who was a naturalist, country naturalist, and so he taught me a lot about what's what. I could identify pretty much all the birds as a kid. I was pretty nerdy, although I was sporty as well. So that an unusual combination of sort of geeky wildlife guy and sporty, athletic-y kind of guy. So it was an
Sounds
unusual
kind of.
combination. It meant I didn't get beaten up behind the bike sheds for knowing that was a dunnock singing there in the garden or whatever. So I learned, a lot about wildlife. I was collecting insects as a kid. I've still got my collection in the living room here, which the grandkids love when they come to stay. And so I knew a lot about what was what in the countryside, and I decided, oh, I'd love to have a career working with nature and wildlife. I wasn't thinking deeply about the morality issues
Mm,
and why we need to conserve. In fact, a lot. I mean, bear in mind, I went to university in the 70s, and a lot of that time, a lot of things happening at that time, we weren't necessarily aware of the damage that they were doing. So,
mm,
so to be honest, environmental degradation was not high on the agenda for me. It was more the fact that I knew quite a lot about the natural world, and I wanted to work with it. And I was lucky enough to some years later, 5 years later, after a bit of sort of zigzagging around, lucky enough to become the first conservationist for the Thames Water Authority for the Thames catchment, the entire
mm.
Thames catchment, 5,000 square miles of England. Um, uh, and that set me off on a career of conservation where I was able to apply my ecological knowledge. And then gradually, of course, well, not gradually, quite quickly, it became evident that things were going badly wrong. And a lot of my work was about trying to
Mm.
stop bad things from happening. And very quickly then moved into trying to restore nature. So I did a lot of the early river restoration in this country in the 80s and 90s.
Mm.
And big wetland creation projects like the London Wetland Centre and the Jubilee River and Otmore RSPB Reserve, big projects that were aiming to bring back nature at scale to try and undo some of the damage that had been done by previous policies, government policies, common agricultural policy, etc.
And so that's interesting to me. So it's I want to work in nature or with nature. To then there's a oh shit, things are going bad and things are going wrong, and that actually there's a protection piece
Mm,
involved in it. Has this idea of what we owe nature and our kind of the human relationship with nature then for you shifted? Because as a feral kid, you're running around and there is this kind of you're part of it. You're climbing trees,
yeah,
you're
building dams in streams, all that stuff, all the
building
time.
dams, you're
Yeah,
in
yeah,
the water, you're on the water, you're up a
yeah,
tree. I
yeah,
can imagine it.
yeah.
As a townie, I've always been very jealous of my feral cousins. But um, but this kind of that connectivity of, oh, I'm part of something and I'm deeply rooted in it. But then there's this sort of you're looking at what's going wrong. And so,
So that only came into my consciousness in a significant way when I started working for the Water Authority.
mm,
I was a single conservation officer, the first of a kind in the country, full time, and I had approximately 3,000 engineers to deal with who were
yeah,
doing potentially damaging things to the environment, pipelines, reservoirs, sewage works, flood defense schemes, plastering rivers with concrete, channelizing, deepening, dredging, straightening. All this, suddenly it became obvious when, when I started in this role, that there was a hell of a lot of damaging stuff happening right in front of my eyes, properly authorized, totally legal policy, following government
Yeah.
policy, and it was all happening right in front of me, and I had to try and do something about that. And so it very quickly became a damage limitation exercise. And I had to I had to find friends in engineering departments, and who would become the champions. And I couldn't do it all on my own. I was quite relatively low grade individual, one guy hurtling around the Thames catchment, visiting multiple sites every day, trying to cajole and coax and persuade and influence people to do things in a more environmentally sustainable way, because it was clear that we were going to be
So,
going
and then
rapidly backward.
and what was it that was like influencing the shift? So like what was working? Is it because you're trying to
Well,
have it, you're having to persuade people, it will be for some it will be cost and wastage. Some will be damage, some will be risk. There are
yeah.
different things. What did you find? Like what were the sweet spots for you? Or was it
Well,
different
the
things
first
for
thing to say
different?
is the reason my role was created was a piece of legislation. And, the bottom line is you've got to have good legislation to then enable good
Mm,
policy and practice. So we had the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which said that water authorities, as they were then, pre-privatisation, had a duty to further conservation when carrying out their functions. And that meant furthering conservation meant maintaining and, where possible, enhancing. That's the way it was legally defined, and it's very significant. Um, so that's the first thing to say. I did have a piece of paper backing me, you
mm,
know, but nevertheless, changing the way a massive 10,000 person organization operates doesn't happen overnight. So all of those things you mentioned, risk,
mm.
cost, moral obligation, they were all relevant. I mean, obviously we didn't talk much about moral obligations
No.
then. Cost was obviously very useful, particularly when it came to dredging, because we used to dredge a lot of our rivers relentlessly for no good reason other than that's what we always did. And the farmer would give the gang of engineers a bottle of whiskey at Christmas, if they
Mm.
came and dredged his streams again, in the middle of nowhere. And it was just done because that's the way it always was. But excuse me, it soon became apparent that you could save quite a lot of money if you weren't
Yeah.
dredging a watercourse every 5 years for no good reason. And it also became very apparent once they started on that journey that it didn't make any difference whether you dredged it or not in terms of, the flooding or the land
Mm.
drainage, that actually you could actually let nature recover and it wouldn't have a significant impact on the farming in that area. So there's no doubt that cost became an issue, but gradually, as we joined Europe and became engaged in European legislation that was more challenging and more demanding, gradually the rules improved. Now they're not perfect, and as you know, below the water level, water quality below the
Yeah.
surface has gone backwards. It's a source of great frustration and almost anger for myself, because I worked tirelessly along with thousands of others to restore rivers physically, particularly above water level. Riverbanks, are now way better than they used to be in terms of vegetation and habitat, but below the water level, things have got badly worse, and that's a really difficult challenge for us now.
And so that's the interest. There's an interesting point there about like so the legislation coming in to say, right, we must control behaviors and we must um it's kind of in the box and in following of rules. To then go from that and be part of rewilding, which and there is legislation for rewilding, but this feels like there's a kind of one feels very tightly held, whereas rewilding feels a little bit like a t completely a different relationship with nature.
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that there isn't really legislation for rewilding per se. I
Okay.
mean, there is still that legislation that various organisations have to further conservation when carrying out their
Mhm.
functions, and obviously there's We still have the Wildlife and Countryside Act that protects species and
Mhm.
habitats. And there's various other, environment acts, etc., which say all the right things. Um, but I think what you're referring to is rewilding is very much an open-ended, much more positive, proactive,
Yeah.
large-scale restoration ambition, which it is, of course, large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature is allowed to take care of itself. That's the definition. And
Yeah, and I
and
think that's the bit. It's about control and it's the role that we play. So
yeah, so
to move,
that's the
yeah,
difficult bit.
to
That's
move
the
from
difficult bit.
control to not controlling.
Yeah,
And there's a massive headspace shift. But I think like to hold on to that thread of morality and a much more emotive feeling, there's a shift in our acknowledgement of the role of nature.
yeah. And this, we are a nation of gardeners, and I
Mhm.
describe, we talk about, Kent being the Garden of England. Well, actually, England is a giant garden.
Yeah.
Pretty much every square meter has been managed by man at some stage, either through livestock grazing or forestry or direct human intervention. Um, so we have this mentality that drives us to want to be in control of everything and
Mm.
not trusting nature, even though we, quite frankly, have fucked it up for decades. We still think that we should be in control, even
Yeah.
though we've clearly not done it right. So trying to get past that is is a big challenge, and we still have this problem with certain outspoken elements of farming community and representative organizations like the NFU who still insist that we need to have control and we need to be managing everything. Otherwise, it'll all go to hell in a handcart. That I've heard that exact
Yeah.
phrase used in a meeting, and
Do you
and
think
that's
that,
the mentality we need to change.
but do you think that's less about actually the control of the land and farmers feeling a loss of control more broadly in farming, whether it's pricing or
It's
legislation?
both.
Do you see what I
Yeah,
mean? Like it
yeah. No,
feels
it's
like
both. It's
it's
both.
both.
It's both.
Mm.
Oh, it's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Again, that's a phrase that I've, before we know it, you'll be introducing wolves and bears. It's kind of, oh, if we start letting go of that, then it's just going to go to pot. So, that's some of the messaging challenges that we face, but they all do basically come from innate human selfishness
Mm.
to want to be doing everything in the way we want and sod everything else.
Yes, I want to get into this about do the things that we want because I've been thinking about the jigsaw puzzle of the language. So you've got conservation, you've got rewilding, you've got restoration, and then regeneration, and then there's permaculture in the mix as well. And it feels like all of these things are different components to a bigger piece about our relationship with nature. And do they, in your head, like, is it about having localized and targeted approach and seeing what's right in a certain location and that's what you pick? Or is there something about what's morally right to in that relationship with nature and the kind of the way that we work with it as part of this? Do you see what I mean? Because it gets complicated because, or does it get complicated? Is also a question I'm going to ask because it feels like some of these words are used interchangeably, but they're very distinct in their approaches for an expert like you.
Yeah. Well, it's not, honestly, it's not that complicated.
Okay.
But because a word like rewilding is often
Mm.
misused, excuse me, misused, people will call not cutting a roundabout, not mowing a roundabout rewilding. Well,
Mm.
it's not. You're just not mowing a roundabout for a couple of months or whatever. But it's a form of nature conservation management, if you like, trying to promote more wildflowers and invertebrates, etc. But s- but the important thing to say is that I, and no self-respecting rewilding enthusiast will suggest that we should be rewilding everywhere. Nobody ever says that. The only people that say that are the opponents to it, who say, well, what, yeah, but how, if we rewild everywhere, how are we going to produce food? Nobody's talking about that who's pro rewilding. So first thing to say is it's just part of the solution. It's not the silver bullet. However, it's a critically important part of the solution because we know that the combination of nature-friendly farming, stewardship, good planning policies, nature reserves, SSSIs, we know all of that for the last 50 years or however long we've been doing it has not been enough to stop us going backwards on biodiversity and losing the battle with climate change mitigation. So whatever we've been doing, great though it is not enough. It might have slowed the decline, but it's not enough to turn things around. And what I am saying is you have to find this other missing piece of the jigsaw that is very large scale and eminently affordable, much cheaper per unit area than say nature reserve management or stewardship schemes.
But who decides what is done where?
So
and in whose interest?
Yeah. So that then brings us back.
Yeah.
That then brings us back to us calling the tune again.
Yeah.
So we can't get away from some kind of human decision making, even if we're talking about rewilding. So we can't get away from that. That, you know, we for example, in order to decide where we might rewild in this country, we need to have some kind of assessment of food production.
Yeah.
You know, and where is the 20% of Britain that produces 3% of the calorific consumption according to the National Food Strategy? 20% of the country produces 3% of the calorific consumption. So where is that 20%? We need to know that. It needs to be on a map, and we need to try and focus policies and funding in those areas and incentivize people in those areas to adopt the rewilding kind of approach, large scale restoration of ecosystems, because that means we can do it without impacting, again, speaking selfishly as a human being, without impacting on our needs, because it won't impact on food production.
So it's complementary to the food system, and actually, if anything, would make food production richer and
yes, because you will get this spillover of healthier soils, healthier air and water, more pollinators, more natural pest control species. You will get this spillover. We are seeing that already from big rewilding projects. They are spilling over all these multiple species into surrounding landscapes where those landscapes have some elements of good habitat that can support them. So yeah, the knock-on benefit, it basically buys you more time to get your house in order with regard to sustainable farming.
And so then, in terms of that and pushing for getting your house in order for more sustainable farming, then do we have targets, or how are we, or is there legislative drives, or is it all voluntary? There were subsidies for rewilding certain areas of land.
Yeah, so what you're referring to there is the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is the replacement public money for public goods kind of approach that we've taken for farming since we left Europe. So for me, the silver lining of Brexit was that we could take on and develop a new farming subsidy kind of arrangement.
Yeah.
And we moved away from the common agricultural policy, which drove farmers to try and produce more and more food from the same amount of land, which was just degrading that land for future generations and, of course, impacting adversely on biodiversity, etc. So we now have this scheme which opens up the opportunity for landscape scale land use change, which is what the top end of that scheme, it's called landscape recovery, that the top tier of that scheme encourages that. Now, there was a document produced 4 years ago, probably now, signed by George Eustace, Secretary of State at the time, that actually included the word rewilding in the description of what that scheme was for. Now, we've gone backwards since then in policy terms, in terms of use of the word. They're not using it anymore, but it is an IUCN adopted word with a clear definition,
Yeah.
set of principles. The globe is adopting rewilding as an option. I've just had a really high level, very important conversation this morning with United Nations representatives about Pakistan because they are desperate now to find ways of rewilding, i.e., large scale ecosystem
Yeah.
restoration, in order to literally save Pakistan potentially from not having sufficient water for its for the people of the country and indeed for their agricultural systems in 30 or 40, 50 years time when the glaciers have all gone. So the globe is adopting rewilding and so should we be. But we with these government cycles we have, even just a change in Secretary of State within one party,
Yeah.
you can go from having quite a lot of support one minute to no support and general opposition the next.
And this is and as you were talking, what it was making me think, where's the public in this? Because if we're talking rewilding, it's, the conversation goes to land use, to farming systems. Not everybody's going to relate to that. And then it becomes about access to nature and conservation and who's part of this drive for healthier societies and environmentally healthy societies. And I was listening to your chat with and I dusted off my old copy of Wilding, and I listened to your conversation with Ben and Isabella Tree, and she was talking about actually rewilding, or wilding can happen anywhere. This is something that actually the introduction into cities is it's about everybody having access to nature and green spaces. But there is something about making this world and that word and making this thinking more accessible and more relevant to more people.
Yeah, well, to be honest, I think we're there on that. That for
Okay.
me is not a big challenge anymore. We
Okay.
we when I was with Rewilding Britain, we engaged in two YouGov polls on rewilding, the acceptance of the word, with a
Hmm.
definition of what we meant by it. And I think it was like 2021 and 2024, roughly speaking. And both times, the popular support for the principle and the word was 80% plus. I think the first time was 80%, and the next time was 81 or 82% support. You would struggle to get that for most things in life, 80%.
No.
Imagine a political party with 80% support. That would be unbelievable.
Mm.
So we're kind of there with public support. And I see this in my daily life, wherever I go, and I'm quite a social kind of guy. I spend a lot of time, down the pub or, when I'm traveling the country, I'm in the local pub. Believe me, the engagement in conversations, it happens all the time in my sporting life. Everyone just wants to talk about rewilding. They want to talk about it with me and they want to talk about it in a positive way. Um, so, I have seen quite a dramatic change in that respect. And since I've been doing this, I've been doing the rewilding stuff for nearly 10 years now.
Yeah.
And I was doing traditional conservation for 40 years before that. So I've seen all aspects, and I still do traditional nature reserve conservation now. I don't, both are really important. But it's rewilding that excites people. People like
Yeah.
the word. There are a few people say, "Oh, I don't like the word." I've had people, mainly people who represent farming organizations. "Oh, I don't like the word. We're not using the word." And there's quite a lot of NGOs, environmental NGOs, who are still scared of using it, which is very disappointing in this day and age, really. But um, but the simple truth is, the public love it.
Mm.
80% popularity rating. That's brilliant. I couldn't hope for more than that. So, and the part of the reason they love it is that they latch on to certain aspects of it that are really exciting. And one of those aspects, and it is only one element of rewilding, are species reintroductions.
Yeah.
Reintroductions of white-tailed eagles, pine martens, beavers, or in other countries, reintroduction of jaguar in South America or bison in Canada, snow leopards. These charismatic projects, charismatic species. That's particularly what captures people's attention. And I don't have a problem with maximizing that and saying, well, yes, that is part of it, and it's such an exciting prospect.
And a great way for people to get involved
Yeah,
and to feel like they're part of something.
yeah, yeah.
And I think what's really interesting to me is how you've had this kind of policy and legislative role. You've advised governments, you've just talked about hanging out with the UN and talking to international governments. The bit that I find icky in the kind of the makeup of the role of different players is when it comes to financial markets and carbon credits, biodiversity tokens, the commodification of nature, and the fact that we can talk about our connectivity, and this goes, and I think this goes back to a moral thing. It goes to a real emotional thing with me. Like I have a very visceral reaction to, I don't want to engage in those conversations when people start talking about nature markets or nature-based markets, because to me, it's that misses the point of our relationship, of what's gone wrong with our relationship with nature and the commodification of nature and the overuse of nature. And like you were saying, this idea of we have to be in control of it and it is there to serve us, to now, we're now like, oh, in order to protect it, we need to, sell nature to save nature kind of idea
Mm.
feels really gross to me. And so I'm kind of interested in what your take on it is.
Yeah.
Is there, firstly, what your take is, and am I right to feel grossed out by it? But if there is hope, where does that sit and who's doing that? Because to me, it feels like the Wild West, where every kind of mainstream financial institution is building instruments which aren't mitigating or managing emissions or impact. Everyone's obsessed with carbon, nobody's thinking about soil. And if we're lucky, people are talking about biodiversity and they're kind of not really. And it feels like, to quote John Major, you're pissing out the tent. And we're getting it wrong.
Yeah, okay. So there's quite a lot in there.
Yeah.
The first thing to say is that we absolutely need private finance
Hmm.
to be co-funding, along with public money, the restoration of nature. That's where the really big bucks are.
Yep.
And it is absolutely the way forward for us to be encouraging that, as far as I'm concerned. But of course, there have to be clear rules around it to avoid it turning into the Wild West.
Mm.
Now, I am involved in discussion, so I also still do, although I've had the privilege of operating at national, international level on policy and strategy, I'm still advising sites across the country on the ground because that is a massively useful way for me to learn about where the blockers are and where bureaucracy is getting in the way and counterproductive policies and all the rest of it. And also, it's really exciting and
Yeah.
inspiring to me as a naturalist to be seeing sites transform dramatically year on year. Now, I am involved in discussions about private finance, big money potentially on some sites, millions potentially, and it is absolutely the way forward. But I spoke recently to the Aldersgate Group, which was chaired by Theresa May, and she, I called there to that group of big businesses um, for an accreditation system for nature markets, for
Mm.
biodiversity markets, and pretty much there's unanimous support in the room for that idea. We have to have a clear set of rules to
Yeah.
stop this system being abused, and also to give the market confidence to engage in it. There's quite a lot of big corporates out there who are probably sitting and waiting for somebody else to move before
Yeah.
they then commit. And it's over
But
2 years.
it depends on what that market is for, because this thing about offsetting, I think, is a misnomer. It feels like a red
Yeah.
herring to me because you're not actually changing your behavior.
No, well,
You're,
that has to be one of the rules, that you
yeah.
have to be the best you can possibly be in terms of the way you operate your business. So it
Hmm.
is not a get out clause for not continually improving on your emissions, continually improving on your your corporate global footprint. You have to be doing all of that stuff as well. But you also should be, and I believe this is a moral, we're talking about morality here. For me, this is a moral obligation. If you're a massive multi-billion pound company, you are bound to be having an impact across the globe currently in ways which you cannot mitigate, no matter how hard you try, because the technology does not exist yet for you to be able to mitigate everything you do properly. And because of the knock-on effect of every bit of the chain in your business, you are going to be you are contributing continually to decline in biodiversity. For that reason, I absolutely believe 100% that you should be contributing towards good flagship projects at scale that are attempting to redress that balance. And sorry, just to finish, if you are a company that suffers from climate change implications like extreme droughts and extreme floods, for example, then it makes total common sense for you to be trying to do something about that as well. So if you can invest your money, imagine you're a big corporate working in a big river catchment towards the bottom end, you've got massive head office or something, and upstream in that river catchment, there is lots of unsustainable land management, and water is rushing off the hills, not being held, and therefore there are drought impacts and flood impacts. It makes total sense for you to be investing in significant upstream thinking. And if you're a pension fund or an insurance company, the same applies. It's good business sense. So I absolutely believe we should be pursuing this, but we have to have a clear set of rules. And ultimately, it will probably become mandatory. But at the moment, it's optional, and there's a lot of hesitancy. We need to be focusing on these places where nature recovery projects are being developed, particularly on private land and on environmental charities land, where that they are going to maximize the benefits of that.
I've seen and heard of a lot of what you would think would be credible, but there just isn't enough. Sometimes it's just not enough resource to manage these programs, or not enough know-how, because sometimes charities are using it, they're dabbling in this alternative market to get income in, but aren't really delivering actual restoration or conservation.
Okay, I've not seen that. I've seen thousands of sites, and
really
I haven't seen any particular bad examples. Not in recent years when I've been working in the rewilding arena, where we're focusing on, restoring natural processes. Or, I mean, obviously some projects are more successful than others. Some lead to a dramatic transformation. Others take much longer, depending on where they are. But I'm yet to, and I've revisited many projects. I've yet to see any yet that are not moving in the right direction and are 100 times better than they were when they started. The thing to remember is we cannot turn things around unless we have this private corporate investment. There is not enough money in the public purse, in the charitable sector, and even in individual private landowners, all of those are doing a lot already.
Yeah.
But there is still not enough. There are these huge businesses out there which are basically taking from the land and the water of this planet and not putting enough back to compensate. So we have to find ways of making that routine. And we have just got to make sure that we get the rules right so it's not exploited.
And so this is the thing about us getting the rules right, and the decisions about what those rules are and who's included in that, and how there's an organization in Scotland that has put a seat on the table for the ocean. And it's like now the ocean is represented on their board.
Yeah.
And how is nature represented in the governance and decision making for different organizations? And we've started thinking about that in the organization that I'm on the board of. And I'm quite intrigued by your, it seems to me that there are these choices of what to prioritize, but also who gets to decide on it. And how, how do we do it? What do we make happen? Who's deciding? What are the benefits for today, but what are the long-term benefits?
Hmm.
Because presumably you're thinking constantly in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the key principles of rewilding is that it needs to be for the long term.
Hmm.
And so when I talk to landowners, pretty much the first thing I say is that you've got to be up for this for life, and ideally for your next generation, um, because it's going to take decades for us to see the full uh, improvement across the spectrum of ecosystem services. You might see, and you will see, very rapid bioabundance
Hmm.
as a result of what you're doing. Within a year or two, you will see rapid return of billions of invertebrates and certain species of birds and mammals. But it will take a lot longer for the soils and the water to truly recover sustainably. So absolutely being it for the long term is always part of my thinking. The other key principle that I have to stick to is this is all about restoring natural processes and not being prescriptive. So
Mm.
when if I'm managing a nature reserve like I do in my village, a reserve that I created, it's only 2 acres, I'm managing that, and I need most of that site to be wildflower meadow, and I want the 2 ponds to remain as 2 ponds, and I want the hedges to not be too thick, but thick enough to have lots of nesting birds. That's managed. I manage that light
Yeah.
touch, but I manage it, and I keep it like that because it's only 2 acres. But when I'm dealing with 2,500 acres, like Broughton,
Yeah.
obviously we can be much more flexible and much more open. And what I will just say is, well, in 10 years' time, you might expect these species to be here, and you probably have roughly this percentage of woodland and this percentage of scrubland and this percentage of grassland. But beyond these speculations, just keep an open mind, and we will only intervene if things are going badly wrong. For example, if the wetland is actually not holding water like it should do, we might have to do some more intervention. I don't have a problem with that. Most rewilding projects in this country are active, not passive. In other words, they require intervention to kickstart recovery. We haven't got time to sit around and wait for passive rewilding to take place over 100 years. We need to act now, act fast. So we are still as humans still making quite a lot of decisions on these
Yeah.
projects. But the idea is that over time we wean ourselves off the gardening approach over
Yeah.
time, over the next generation or two. And we relieve ourselves, we cure ourselves of ecological tidiness disorder, which which is something that obviously the country suffers from. So yeah, we can't avoid it. We are the sentient species in this landscape, and I think there is a duty on us to make the best of what we know.
Can you talk to me a little bit about the movement of animals and the role that animals play in, and kind of keystone species in population control, but also sparking and accelerating some of the things that you're talking about, and how that is one way of intervention that is reaping rewards in this
Yeah.
space.
Well, this comes back to the principle around natural processes, restoring natural processes at scale. And one of those very important natural processes is herbivory. Big grazing animals, browsing, chewing, tearing, all sorts of vegetation, and indeed disturbing the soil and dunging and all the rest of it. Now, we now know there's enough research around now to tell us and show us that having ideally quite mobile herds of large herbivores, whether they be, rare breed cattle or Iron Age pigs or whatever, roaming over big areas, are pretty good proxies for what we once had: aurochs, wild boar, elk, bison, beaver, etc. We've lost most of those things from British countryside. There's a few boar, and there are now increasing numbers of beavers. but still relatively small proportion of the countryside with those species in. So we need to think about restoring that natural process of herbivory back into the landscape. And there's some really interesting research coming out of NEP, for example, that shows that with these large herbivores in the landscape, with scrub and grassland, etc., that scrub and grassland can generate something like 5 tons of carbon per hectare per annum, compared with 20-year-old woodland, which does 6 tons carbon per hectare per annum sequestration. So it measures up pretty well over that kind of time frame in terms of carbon, and that's just carbon. But we also know, of course, that these sites generate fantastic biodiversity both above and below ground. So we know that herbivores have to be part of this, and if we can't have bison, elk, and boar, for example, we'll have to use proxies for them, and rare breed cattle and Iron Age pigs, for example, are good examples of where sites are using these things. So that's good. That's relatively doable because they're all, you can have, there are no great licensing obstructions to that. And then you need to think about, okay, so what about the apex predators? And at the moment, we are really the only significant apex predator in the landscape at the moment, human beings. We don't have wolves and bears and lynx. So unfortunately, for the time being, we have to continue to be that apex predator, and we need to try and mimic the kind of impact that they would have by harvesting some of these large herbivores periodically.
And so there is a kind of moral decision making on this, right? In terms of that intervention piece and us making decisions that we know will disadvantage or diminish or kill certain species or communities for the sake of others because we're holding a bigger picture.
Yeah.
There is a playing God in that.
Yeah. We are still making a decision, but don't forget, we are making a decision to try and undo the detrimental impacts of what we did historically for good reasons at the time.
Yeah.
But actually, at a time when there weren't any rules, we literally hunted things to extinction. And now we know that having removed those from like most of the rest of Europe has most of these species, and we now know. I've been to see, you need to go to Romania, places like that, to see the incredible habitats that are there still with all of these species in them, and how different and sustained and sustainable they are. So it would be morally wrong for us not to take account of that knowledge. Like I say, we are privileged to be the only species that's able to assimilate that kind of learning, and we should surely make the best of it. That, for me, that is a moral obligation.
And then talk to me about if you go to somewhere like Romania, where this richness of diversity and this richness of ecosystems exist. Is there I don't know anything about the Romanian conservation landscape. So is there a kind of, oh, we need to protect this, or is there a trying to stop development or industrialization or action or activity or urban development as part of a conservation drive in countries where this richness still exists? And how do
Well,
we
yeah, I
manage,
think
and how do you manage your kind as you work with governments around the world, is there a reconciliation of, oh, we can't tell people not to develop or urbanize their land? Or
well,
how does that play out in the work that you do?
yeah, well, the first thing to say is it is when when I talk about Romania, I'm talking specifically about the Carpathian Mountains, where Conservation Foundation, Conservation Carpathia, set up by an amazing couple, Barbara and Christoph Bromberger. They basically are seeking to protect the forests and mountains and amazing wildflower meadows that are still farmed, by the way. They're still hay cut, but
Yeah.
it's all done very sensitively. They are seeking to protect them, particularly from illegal forestry and illegal hunting.
Okay.
because they still have most of the species you should have. And they all they've introduced is bison and beaver, but they have all the others. They have, bears and they have wolves,
Hmm.
and lynx, etc. So so it's all about protection. It's recognizing that they have something really special and it's pretty big scale. And if they look after it,
Hmm.
they can generate, and again, this comes back to human selfishness, but obviously it's critically important. They can then generate socioeconomic stability in a region like so many others in Europe where there's mass evacuation
Yeah.
from the countryside to the cities. And
Hmm.
by generating this amazing nature-rich landscape and beautiful, stunningly beautiful, um, they can generate a light touch nature tourism industry that keeps people going. And I saw that for myself. I stayed in some amazing places that are in that market. And they can also engage with smallholders and farmers in foraging wild food and marketing it locally, small scale, sort of cottage industry for, food products, fungi and fruits, etc. So, there is a fantastic interconnection with socioeconomic resilience.
Yeah.
And that's so important because the world, wherever I travel in the world, I am hearing of this mass exodus,
Yeah.
from the countryside. I mean, I was just in Idaho recently, uh, with Rewilding America, releasing wild horses back into Idaho, um, to help restore
Yeah.
prairie grasslands. The population density there is one person for every 87 square kilometers. Unbelievable, unbelievably low population density. And that's because there's very little there of any interest apart from just cattle ranches. And cattle ranches are, in terms of people per square mile or kilometer, they're, tiny, tiny
No one
number of
around.
jobs. So there's definitely scope for integrating this nature recovery at scale with socioeconomic resilience. And again, I come back to it again. It's all about us.
Yeah.
But we belong here. We mustn't forget that we have every right to be here just as much as a red admiral butterfly or a pine marten or whatever. We belong here. 200,000 years plus we've been here. Can we be here without impacting on everything else? And the answer is yes, we can. But we've got to take a step change to make that happen.
And I think there's something, and closer to home, I'm working with people in Spain because there's in phenomenal amounts of literature and news coming out of, they're calling it empty Spain because the rural communities are
Yeah,
depleting.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Um, and the
Same all
approach,
over
yeah,
much of Europe. Yeah,
and and the way that we're looking at this is that it takes an ecosystem. Regeneration is about an ecosystem build. So you have to look at, as much as you look at land regeneration, you're looking at the regeneration of communities, you're looking at the regeneration of cultures, you're looking at the regeneration of economic systems and viable, sustainable businesses that people and livelihood creation to be able to bring these areas back to life. It can't just, you can't do one without the others. And having a very conscious integration and seeing the interconnectedness and the interdependencies of all of those things,
mm,
as the only way forward. Because otherwise, like you say, these vast areas are just being depleted,
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
which then has massive knock-on effects on food systems and localized approaches to, and the fact that we need to have much more localized approaches to food security.
Yeah, yeah,
So, in closing, because I'm conscious of your time, you, like you said right at the beginning, actually, it was your opener of, you've got it really straight in your head of what needs doing and how it needs doing. And
yeah,
you've got a very tight compass of what the trade-offs are. And there's a humility. I think there's a massive humility in the way that you talk about us as humans and the role of and our relationship with the moths and the butterflies and the badgers and the beavers. It's there's a oneness to it. which probably comes from the feral child in you. Um, but where does like what gives you that moral clarity and what helps you sleep at night when actually it is it is complex?
Um, well, there's a couple of things. First of all, I'm no spring chicken, as you can tell by looking at me. Nearly fit, like I said, nearly 50 years as a professional.
Mhm.
I've got limited time, left. I still got bags of energy, and I want to keep doing what I'm doing for as long as I can. And I intend to go full on,
Mhm.
literally until I drop. But I haven't got that much time, so I need to be clear and I need to be determined as ever, and I need to get on with it. I need to not be faffing around with this. So, and I have the good fortune to be working um, with organizations and individuals who are like-minded. So that's great. That satisfies me in terms of knowing that I'm making the best use of my time. First, so that's the first thing. And this applies across the whole environmental restoration spectrum. We haven't got much time. So, if we want to make it slightly easier for future generations to win these battles against climate and biodiversity loss, we got to crack on. So we cannot afford to be trying to be perfect with this.
Yeah.
80% is good enough, and that's always been a key sort of watchword phrase for me, is that I've got to go with my instincts on this. I've now I brag about probably having visited and advised more sites than any other individual in this country. It's several thousand sites. And just I worked it out for the last 8 years or so when I was with Rewilding Britain. I advised over 250,000 acres of land. So I've seen a lot, and I've seen what works and I've seen what doesn't work. And I've seen what works sometimes, but not at other times because of certain circumstances. So I have to go. It would be foolish of me not to go with my gut instinct on things. And I think landowners, farmers and landowners appreciate the straight talking, when they'll come up with, do you think I should do this? And I'll tell them straight, well, I really don't actually. I've got several examples where that didn't work out, and this is why it didn't work out. And if I was you, I'd do that instead. And this applies across my work. Now, the challenge comes when you're trying to persuade government to change policy. That kind of attitude doesn't really work. So I also have to be a bit cannier, and play a longer game when trying to influence government policy. And that might mean, 2 steps forward, 1 step back quite a lot. Because I recognize, of course, that if you're going to, in a democratic society, you've got to be very patient, and you've got to be prepared for things to take years when they
And
should
you've got to
really only take
play,
weeks.
and you've got to play all sides because, like you were saying earlier, your party could change or there's a
Yeah,
cabinet reshuffle
yeah.
and the person that you've been talking to and wooing is out.
That's right. So often all down to the individual you're dealing with. Secretary of
Yeah.
State, it can, one can be great and the next one can be useless. And so even within parties, and this is why, I mean, it's a big sweeping statement, but our democratic system and our 4-year cycle of government is not fit for purpose
No.
for tackling climate change and biodiversity loss. It just is not fit for purpose because it is too prone to random changing of direction at the whim of an individual. And we need to, society as a whole, that's particularly in the Western world, needs to sort that out. Because it's not just us; it's the same
Yeah.
across most democratic countries.
And you've not talked about your grandkids, but I've seen you in action with kids, and it is the most inspiring thing I've ever seen. And you're educating, I mean, and exciting kids in a way that I just, it's like the medicine man. It was like the Mothman. Um,
Look into
I mean,
my eyes.
it's like the creepy crawlies come out. I mean,
Yeah.
I've never been so enthralled by like, I don't know, 50 moths in my life, let alone the fact that I had to compete and I had to be nice to a 7-year-old and a 6-year-old and let them look first because otherwise I was like elbowing them out the way. But I've seen
And
you
off.
in, well, you know, they were cute, but they
Yeah.
went the way. But I've seen you with kids and educating
Yeah, I
kids.
love that. I really love that. I have 11 grandchildren in America. I have
Oh,
three
crikey.
sons, and two of them live in America, and they've got 11 grandchildren between them. Now, sadly, because there's so many of them, they don't get to come here very
Mm.
often. But occasionally, when they do come here, before they've even got the bags out of the car, they want to see the bug collection.
Of course they do.
The bags are still in the garden, and Granddad, can we see the bug collection? I've still got, so I've still got my collection from when I was a kid in
Yeah.
the cabinet in the lounge. And so we have to go and open the drawers. The first thing they want to see is a stag beetle and a death's head hawk moth and and I love all
I
it.
want to come and see the bug collection, let the kids. But there is this, but I think from a kind of intergenerational point of view and responsibility point of view, I think you're inspiring that next generation with curiosity and wonder. And you also never talk down to anybody. Like you're not talking to kids, you're just talking to little people.
Yeah.
Um, which I think is
I
a
feel like a kid when I'm kind of there, like because I feel as excited as hopefully they are. But you've touched on something that, since I saw you
Mm.
last, I've come to realize, and I've actually now made a move to do something about it. I need to be, I need to be offloading what's in my head to
Mhm.
a younger generation. And I had the privilege of meeting a group called Young Wilders. I showed them around Broughton Sanctuary, in fact, earlier this year. 18 to 30-year-old kind of group.
Mhm.
Really fantastic group, very enthusiastic, quite knowledgeable, some of them,
Yeah.
others less so, but really wanted to become more knowledgeable. And also I've taken on a role with heel rewilding as a sort of specialist advisor, informally for them. And I've said to them, look, I would, could we find a way of me just spending time with young graduates and volunteers and maybe people who are employed as well in this field, just so that I can try and offload this kind of the land reading. How do I read land? Because this is
Yeah.
something I've learned over decades. It was not taught to me. I've just learned how to read the land and assess what might be done, what might not be done, and what obviously I know what wildlife's there, so I can point that out and help them with that learning. But I think now at this stage of my career, I really need to do more of that.
Yeah.
Um, and so that is actually going to be a priority for me now going forward.
Oh, that's really beautiful. I think because, I mean, you love it. I mean, you light up. I mean, it's, you light up as you're doing it, but seeing the kids' reaction and just thinking there's something being sparked, there's an imagination, there's a curiosity, there's oh, I want to go get a microscope or I want to go and get one of these contraptions and I want to be looking at watching moths. And,
Yeah, yeah,
the first thing I did when I spotted that moth was send a picture to you to say, crazy stuff is happening in London.
yeah,
What am I looking at? And it is this kind of general excitement
yeah.
that
Yeah, I
that
love all that. I mean,
yeah.
that's exactly why I'm about to head off down to check some hedgehogs out in the village because I everyone in the community knows that I'm the guy they must send photos of wildlife to if they want to know what it is. And I love just engaging people who I would never normally encounter in
Yeah.
my day-to-day job. But it just, if just one little encounter like that inspires them to be a little more concerned,
Hmm.
then that's a step forward, isn't it? It's a big step forward.
So if there's one assumption about how we think about and how we show up with regards to kind of our moral relationship with nature, what would it be? If there was one thing that you'd want to change about assumptions that we make or that switch that you're wanting to ignite.
Well, the the hard truth is, and I know it's been said before, not least by Attenborough and others, but we need to understand. more about nature
Mm-hmm.
in order to value it properly. We need to know more about what's what out there. It's no good just having the odd nerdy guy like me who knows what every bird song is and what every moth is and every flower. That's not good enough. We need to regather and regain that knowledge of nature
Mm-hmm.
in order to cherish it properly. And the wonderful Mary Colwell is, has been battling for a natural history GCSE for years now, and I don't know if we're nearly there. I think we might be nearly. She might be nearly there on it, but that needs to be a given, that you have the opportunity for people to learn once again about what's what out there, because 100 years ago your average child knew far more
Yeah.
about what wildlife is what in the countryside. And by the way, it's not a town versus country thing. I can go into any country village and there'll be lots, a great proportion of the population who won't know the difference between a carrion crow and a rook, who won't know the difference between a red admiral and a small tortoiseshell butterfly. And that's not good enough. If we're going to start to value these things, we've got to understand them. We're going to know what they are, why they're there, what they need, because like we've been discussing, we are going to be still making the decisions about
Mm-hmm.
what happens on land and sea on this planet, and we've just got to do much better on that.
Because if you don't know, you're not going to care. And if you don't
No,
care,
exactly.
you're not going to
That's the basic
protect.
principle. Yeah,
You're
exactly.
just not going to protect, are you, if you
Yeah.
don't care?
And with the technology we've got now, with apps and even AI, double-edged sword though it is, there is no excuse for us not being far more knowledgeable about these things going forward.
Well, you're on a mission.
I am.
The
Ain't done
Mothman.
yet.
The Mothman continues through the villages of the UK and globally. I can't thank you enough. It's been an
Thank you.
absolute treat. I could talk to you for days. I'm going to let you go and save hedgehogs.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If this conversation sparked something in you, don't let it end here. Share this episode with someone who needs to hear it, or better yet, gather your people and dive deeper into these ideas together. The world changes one meaningful conversation at a time. If you'd like to join one of our group order sessions, keep an eye on our website, which is www.deepameaningful.co, or sign up to our monthly newsletter and be the first to know what's coming up. The Udder is brought to you by the Deep and Meaningful Consultancy. Our music is from the song Unreasonable World by Bernard Schimpelsberger.